Okay, so now we want to add and subtract rational expressions. The whole reason that we spent time finding the least common multiple and the least common denominator was to be able to actually add and subtract rational expressions. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to find that least common denominator. Once we find that least common denominator, then we're going to change our fractions. Remember, we're going to multiply by whatever factors we need to achieve that least common denominator. Remember, we're going to multiply by the numerator and by the denominator by whatever factor that we would need. Now, this is important. If we are happening to subtract, then what we want to do is make sure that we distribute the subtraction sign as if it were a negative to the numerator. Okay? Then we want to combine the like terms. Remember, when we're doing anything with a fraction and we combine like terms, we do that to the numerator only. The denominator stays the same and we combine the numerator terms. All right, so then our answer would be the simplified numerator divided by that common denominator. All right, so let's look at a couple here. We're going to start off nice and easy just to remind ourselves how we actually add and subtract fractions. All right, so no real variables in our denominator. So let's look at this first one. We've got ourselves a 3 and a 12. So remember, our first step is to find that common denominator. So when we find our common denominator between 3 and 12, so I'm going to put least common denominator up here. The least common denominator would be a 12. So now we're going to look at each of those two fractions, those rational expressions, and decide, well, what factor would we need to multiply numerator and denominator by to achieve that least common denominator? So we would need to multiply by a 4 on this first expression, on this first fraction, but we don't need to multiply anything on the second one because it already has that least common denominator. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and do the math here. So we're going to actually multiply here. So we're going to distribute. We would end up getting 20x over 12. We didn't need to do anything to the second one, so we leave it as x minus 2 over 12. So now both of our fractions have that common denominator. So now what we want to do is we want to combine our like terms for our numerator only. So combining those like terms, we would get the numerator would now be 20x plus x minus 2. And our denominator stays as that 12. So now let's actually do our math here. We're going to combine those like terms, meaning I'd put the 20 and the x together, giving me 21x minus 2 over 12. Okay, I look, the numerator cannot be simplified anymore. So I've got the numerator is simplified over that common denominator. Okay, so let's amp it up just a little bit, not too much. We're going to look at our next example here. We want to find that least common denominator. So our least common denominator here, I'm going to look and I say, okay, well, between the 5 and the 2, I'm going to have a 10. And then I look, I've got an x and an x cubed, so it's going to be an x cubed. So now we need to decide, okay, well, what will we need to multiply each of these by to get that least common denominator? So the first one's going to need to get multiplied by a 2 and an x squared. So I have 2x squared here, 2x squared here. The second expression is going to need to get multiplied by a 5, but it already has the x's that it needs. All right, so remember when we do this, we're going to be distributing. So I like to go ahead and put parentheses around the original numerators so you can kind of see it there. So let's go ahead and distribute here. I'm going to have 8x cubed plus 2x squared. Remember what we said, if it is subtraction, which it is, that I want to go ahead and distribute that negative. So really what I want is a negative 5 to get distributed. Then I can say negative 15x minus 10. And I'm going to have that all over that common denominator of 10x cubed. So I skipped that one little intermediate step last time where they were separate. See over here, I had them separate and then I put them together. I'm hoping that we can kind of jump to that next step where I distribute and then write it all as one numerator over that common denominator. Okay, but that's the same thing that I did in the last one. Right, so now that they are together, I can go ahead and combine my like terms. Okay, there's nothing that is alike here. Okay, so what that means is I'm going to leave it all exactly the same, because in my numerator it was as simplified as it could be. So remember, it's simplified numerator divided by that common denominator. All right, let's try a couple more, make sure we're getting it here. Okay, looking at our next one, we're going to start off with that least common denominator. So we look at this, that means I'm going to have 3x plus 1 times x minus 2 as our least common denominator. I'm going to then need to multiply my first function by a x minus 2. And I'll need to multiply my second fraction here by a 3x plus 1. Okay. Remember, when I'm saying multiplying, I mean to distribute. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to distribute that 2x to the x minus 2. So I'm going to get 2x squared minus 4x. I'm going to distribute that 4. So I'm going to end up with 12x plus 4. All right. Then it's going to go over that common denominator of 3x plus 1 times x minus 2. Okay. Now that I have gotten my numerator ready to go, I'm going to combine any like terms. So I see I've got a like term here of my x's. So I'm going to have 2x squared. Now it's going to be plus 8x plus 4 all over that common denominator of 3x plus 1 times x minus 2. Right? So we've got our simplified numerator over our common denominator. Okay, let's try another. We're just practicing, making sure that we've kind of tried one of each type, making sure that we're kind of understanding here. So the first step, I'm going to go for that least common denominator. Now, on the other ones, there was nothing to factor. But when I look at this one, remember when we looked at least common denominators, sometimes we had to factor the denominator first. So in this one, I actually need to factor this first one to be 2y plus 3 times 2y minus 3, right? So I've now factored that. So now I can see that the least common denominator is going to be 2y minus 3 times 2y plus 3, right? So with that being said, I need to decide what do I need to multiply by to get that common denominator. What we notice is that that first expression already has the full common denominator. So I don't need to multiply anything by it. So I'm just going to kind of write that one down already because it's already ready to go, y plus 1. But the next one I need to multiply by a 2y plus 3. So here I would need to multiply by a 2y plus 3. All right, remembering that this is subtraction, so when I distribute this 4, I really want to distribute it as a negative 4. Okay, so I'm going to distribute a negative 4, which is going to give me negative 8y minus 12. And honestly, that right there is the biggest mistake that a lot of people make. Because you're going fast through this, there's lots of writing everywhere, and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And then all of a sudden you forget a negative. So I have to be careful when it is subtraction that that minus becomes a negative that I distribute, okay? So now my common denominator on the bottom, 2y plus a 3 and 2y minus a 3. I can go combine any like terms. So in the numerator, I notice that I've got y's that I could combine. So I'm going to have negative 7y, and I have my constants that I can combine. So I'm going to have a negative 11, and all that's going to be over that common denominator of 2y plus a 3 and 2y minus a 3. All right. Okay, I got two more, just making sure that we've got it going on here. We're going to first get that least common denominator. So I need to factor again on this one. I'm going to have p plus 7, p minus 2. So I notice that my common denominator is going to be p plus 7 times p minus 2. So that means the first fraction already has that common denominator. So I can leave that p plus 5 alone. However, the second one does not have the whole denominator. I need to multiply by a p minus 2. All right, so I'm going to now distribute that 2. So I'm going to get 2p and a negative 4 over that common denominator of p plus 7 over p times p minus 2. All right, now I'm going to combine any like terms that I have. So I've got a p and a 2p gives me 3p. I've got a positive 5 and a minus 4, which gives me 1 over that common denominator, p plus 7 times p minus 2. Okay. All right, hopefully we're getting the hang of the steps. All right, so let's try one more. If you want to pause it, try it yourself first and then check, whatever you want to do. Or you can just follow along again. Here we go. I want to find that least common denominator. So that least common denominator, I need to make sure that I factor this second one here. I can factor out a 5x, which will leave me with x plus 3. So my least common denominator here is going to be 5x, x plus 3, and x minus 2. We've got lots here, okay? So when I look at the first fraction, I need to multiply it by the 5x and by the x plus 3. Doing that to the numerator and the denominator, right? I look at my next fraction. I need to make sure that I'm going to multiply now by my x minus 2 to that numerator and denominator. Okay, so we've got lots going on. And so remember, when I say multiply, I mean I'm going to distribute. So let's look at the first one. I need to first distribute that 5x. So I'm going to do a couple steps here. So I've got 5x minus 5x squared. Then I'm still going to need to multiply that by x plus 3. So now let's distribute it through. I've got 5x squared plus 15x minus 5x cubed minus 15x squared. Combining those like terms, I'm going to have a negative 5x cubed minus 10x squared plus 15x. Okay, so all that is that first fraction. Now let's look at the second fraction. I'm going to need to distribute that negative 4 to the x and that minus 2. So I'm going to have it negative 4x plus 8. All of that's going to be over that common denominator of 5x times x plus 3 times x minus 2. Okay, the bigger that least common denominator is, the more math I'm going to have to use to get to it. All right, so now last thing I need to do, I need to see if I can simplify any of that numerator. I can simplify because I've got a 15x and a negative 4x. So I keep that negative 5x cubed, that negative 10x squared. Now I'm going to have an 11x and a plus 8 all over that common denominator, 5x, x plus 3, x minus 2. Okay. So hopefully now we notice that some of them are going to be pretty short and easy. Some of them are going to be a little bit longer. Okay, but the steps that you want to remember, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get that least common denominator. I'm going to multiply each of those rational expressions, each fraction, by what I need to get that common denominator. Making sure if it is subtraction that I distribute a negative through with it. Then I'm going to combine like terms in my numerator. And finally, I'll write my answer as the simplified numerator over that least common denominator.